Fall Blau, the Eastern Front Part 2. On January 7 the Soviet counter-offensive halted, having mostly achieved its objective of protecting Moscow. However, the inhospitable conditions of the Russian winter didn't stop the Red Army from attempting to carry on the fight. The German army still held a salient around the town of Rzhev, uncomfortably close to Moscow. The Soviet High Command, under orders to protect the capital at all costs, demanded the position be taken. The Wehrmacht quickly realized the value of the position, and dug in with over 20 divisions. Defenses were carefully prepared, and it was clear to see the salient would be costly to take. Yet despite this, in typical Soviet fashion, the Red Army began to launch attacks. Starting on January 8, the Red Army began launching assaults against the fortified positions. Russian soldiers fell by their thousands, mowed down by machine guns and artillery. The Soviets labeled the battle the Rzhev Meat-Grinder, and their attacks made little progress. While attacks were limited in the winter, by the summer the Soviet offensives began to reach a depressing scale. In the large open fields around the salient, Russian soldiers were annihilated by artillery and their ranks mowed down by machine guns. It was truly a massacre. Soviet soldiers reportedly went into battle crying, for they knew their death was almost certain. Men cried for their mothers while running. Conscripts, who had received pitiful training, were thrust into German machine guns. The soldiers who entered the meat grinder were young men, though Rzhev spat them out as mangled husks of flesh. Meanwhile on the Leningrad front, the Soviets achieved far greater success, encircling over 100,000 German soldiers at Demyansk. Copying the Wehrmacht's infamous tactic, it looked like the Soviets were about to achieve a great victory. The annihilation of 100,000 men was unacceptable to the German High Command. The Reich was beginning to run out of men to conscript, and whilst the Soviets could easily bounce back from terrifying losses, the Wehrmacht was in a more precarious position. As a result, the Luftwaffe was sent in to resupply the encircled men by an air bridge. This was fairly successful, and on March 22 a breakout attempt succeeded. The Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses, 265 planes lost, and two-thirds of the encircled forces were incapacitated in the fighting, thus rendering the breakout almost useless to the Wehrmacht. The head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, believed the operation to be a great success, and would later use Demyansk as an example to convince Hitler to use air supply at Stalingrad, a decision that would cost the Wehrmacht 22 divisions. Further north, in Leningrad itself, conditions remained much the same as they had in 1941. Mass starvation, constant shelling and an utter stalemate on the front lines. A Soviet offensive on January 7 was crushed, and the front was quiet for the rest of 1942. On May 12, the Red Army launched a surprise attack on the Kharkov salient, yet another product of the winter counteroffensive. The attack, the Second Battle of Kharkov, was somewhat successful, though soon was annihilated by Luftwaffe air superiority. On May 17, German forces launched a decisive counter-offensive, rolling the Soviet advance back into an encirclement. The panzers quickly closed in, and by the 30th, 3 Soviet field armies had been destroyed. The Second Battle of Kharkov was even more disastrous for the Soviets than the first was, though this time it provided the base for an entire German offensive. The Sixth Army pressed its advantage, encircling the Soviet 28th Army on June 13. By June, the muddy ground had finally dried over, and the Wehrmacht launched its long-awaited summer offensive. The Red Army, though still standing as large as ever, was beleaguered by the failures of their winter and spring attacks. The 1942 summer offensive, named Fall Blau, Case Blue, by the German High Command, would be pivotal in the outcome of the war in the East, crucial in the outcome of the Second World War. It was a make-or-break moment for the Third Reich, a last attempt. Its failure doomed Nazi Germany to the inevitable outcome. The Wehrmacht planned for a drive south, with the main objectives the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Soviets instead believed the summer offensive would be directed at Moscow, and thus were caught by surprise when the Germans attacked on the southern front. The final objective was Baku and the oil fields that surrounded it. By 1942 the Nazi High Command had realized that there was no quick way to win the war in the east, but denying the Soviets the majority of their oil supply would greatly weaken the Red Army, whilst bolstering the Wehrmacht. On June 28, an entire year since the beginning of Barbarossa, Fall Blau started. Amassed German forces smashed through Soviet lines, using their air superiority to destroy defensive positions. Russian soldiers soon broke, scattering into the countryside. The start of the battle echoed Barbarossa, though this success was not destined to last. German infantry advanced behind the air attacks, riding on the panzers to cover great distances quickly. Soon they had reached Voronezh, where house-to-house fighting broke out. German infantry from the 4th Panzer Army quickly advanced through the city, and by July 6 had pushed the Soviets out. From Voronezh the attack turned south, following the Donets River to the Caucasus. Rostov had fallen by August, and Group B had begun to push towards Stalingrad. To the Nazi High Command, the offensive looked like a great success, breaking the stalemate in the east. However, as the Soviets began transferring units to the south from the Moscow front, their defense became more determined. On July 28, Stalin issued Order No. 227, not one step back, in which he demanded that divisions hold their ground and not retreat. While the Wehrmacht still made progress, upon entering the Caucasus the German advance slowed tremendously. The Caucasus were an extremely hilly region, and the further the Wehrmacht went, the worse the terrain became. The massed panzer units faltered quickly in the mountainous terrain, and most of the heavy lifting was left to the infantry. By October it was clear to see Baku would not be taken by the Wehrmacht, and so instead the Luftwaffe was ordered to begin bombing the Soviet oil fields. The strike set some oil refineries ablaze, though the action was so half-hearted that the Soviets' fuel supply was barely impacted. The furthest south the Wehrmacht got was Mount Elbrus, still many miles from Baku. A German party reached the mountain's peak and planted a swastika flag, though immediately withdrew. The conditions were so inhospitable that by November all advances had halted. Meanwhile, as Army Group A pushed southwards, Army Group B took up offensive positions on the eastern flank. On the 23rd of August, the most infamous Battle of Fall Blau, possibly the most infamous battle in history, began. The Battle of Stalingrad. The city of Stalingrad was located between the River Don and River Volga, and controlling it was vital for the Wehrmacht to maintain its east flank. By August they had reached the city's outskirts, and the Luftwaffe began an aerial campaign on the 23rd. The vast majority of the city was a communist slum, made of cheap, flammable buildings. The bombing campaign lasted until November, leveling large areas of the city complex. However, the bombing achieved the opposite of the intended effect, as the rubble heaps became invaluable positions for hidden snipers and machine gunners. Citizens were drafted in to help defend the city, and Stalingrad became a maze of trenches and defensive positions. By September, spearheads of elite units had pierced the city's suburbs, and had entered Stalingrad proper. Here the infamous house-to-house fighting began, as the Soviets grimly held each ruin on each street, forcing the Germans to take each wreck or risk leaving Soviet units in their rear. Some buildings remained intact despite the bombing, becoming strongpoints for Soviet defenders. Brick dust kicked up by the constant explosions coated everything, to the extent that it became hard to tell friend from foe. Soviet defenders took up positions as close to the Germans as possible, in order to dissuade the Luftwaffe from bombing them. As a result, most fighting was hand-to-hand, with bayonets and grenades. A Panzer Grenadier officer wrote,
"We have fought for 15 days for a single house, with mortars, machine guns, grenades and bayonets. The front is a corridor between burned-out rooms. The street is no longer measured in meters, but in corpses. Animals flee this hell, the hardest stones cannot bear it for long, only men endure."
The German advance slowly crawled forward, and in October the fighting pivoted north into Stalingrad's industrial sector. Soldiers scurried about in the husks of great factories, battles raged on every street. German soldiers began describing Stalingrad as the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. The situation was even worse for the Soviets. Stalingrad hugged the river Volga, and by October the Germans had pushed the Red Army to its banks. The only way to reinforce its soldiers was to send men across the Volga on barges, under constant bombardment from aircraft and artillery. By November the Wehrmacht had reached the Volga, slicing the Red Army in half. All the Soviets could do was flood the city with a constant stream of conscripts, causing horrific casualties. All the Soviets could do was flood the city with a constant stream of conscripts, causing horrific casualties on both sides. Stalin demanded the city must be held at all costs, and the battle became one of ideological importance, not just strategic. The battle would be the bloodiest in history, though the majority of deaths would come after the fighting in the streets had ended. Soon, the entire Eastern Front was in stalemate. Fall Blau had failed, with Baku still in Soviet hands and Stalingrad merely grinding down the Sixth Army. Even worse, the Russian winter arrived for a second time, and once again echoing Barbarossa the Soviets planned a winter counteroffensive. The first objective was to eliminate the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the second was to destroy all of Army Group South. On November 19, 1942, Romanian soldiers were woken by an hour-long rocket barrage, followed by an enormous assault of Soviet tanks. The Romanians, unwillingly fighting alongside the Germans, hundreds of miles from their homeland, fled in panic. The Soviets attacked in two pincers, either side of the city. All German units on the front were inside Stalingrad itself, leaving demoralized and ill-equipped foreign troops on the flanks. These Romanian and Italian soldiers collapsed under the sudden Russian attacks, leading to the flanks caving in. At 4 p.m., the 23rd of November 1942, the two Soviet pincers linked up. The Soviets had successfully encircled Stalingrad, trapping 300,000 German soldiers inside. It soon dawned on the Wehrmacht High Command, an entire German army was faced with destruction. Back in Berlin there was a flurry of action. Hitler was convinced by Göring that an air bridge could adequately supply the pocket, though this was soon proved ridiculous. In December, he also ordered General Manstein to attempt to break out the Sixth Army, though this also failed. For the men in Stalingrad, the conditions gradually worsened. Food supplies quickly ran out, and the pocket began to shrink. Men froze to death in -40 degrees, others starved. Some resorted to cannibalism. By the end of the battle, almost two-thirds of the original 300,000 men would be dead. If things didn't look grim enough for Germany anyway, on December 12 the Red Army launched Operation Little Saturn. Designed to exploit German weakness on the Don front, the Soviets planned to completely reverse all German gains of 1942 by forcing the German army to withdraw from the Caucasus. The Soviet attacks were outstandingly successful, and threatened to trap Army Group A in the Caucasus. This led the Wehrmacht High Command to immediately, though reluctantly, pull out of the Caucasus, either through Crimea or the Rostov corridor. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, head of the Sixth Army, surrendered to the Soviets. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The Third Reich lost 22 divisions. It seemed to both sides that this was the beginning of the end, that this war might finally be won and lost. However, the world would not be so lucky. The German retreat did not stop after evacuating the Caucasus, and instead carried on to Kharkov. Meanwhile in the north, the Germans finally withdrew from Rzhev, massacring the local population as they went. In March, as the Soviets retook Kharkov, the German army faced crisis. It was at this point Hitler gave Field Marshal Manstein operational freedom, allowing him to start the Third Battle of Kharkov on February 19, 1943. Just as the first two were, the Third Battle of Kharkov was extremely successful for the Germans. The Soviets had become overextended in pursuing the Germans to Kharkov, and thus were easily flanked and encircled by German troops. This opened up the road to Kharkov, allowing a new SS Panzer Division to retake the city on March 15. With the Soviets stunned by the surprise counterattack, Manstein pushed on to Belgorod. The city soon falls too, and a large salient around Kursk is created. The advance halts on March 18, and the Eastern Front goes silent. The end of March sees the end of action on the Eastern Front until summer. The lines are practically the same as they had been a year before. All Fall Blau had achieved was the deaths of millions. The Wehrmacht was running out of men and material. The Soviets had lost hundreds of thousands of men. Yet the Soviets could still replace their losses. The Third Reich had only enough for one last attempt. The upcoming Battle of Kursk would be the decisive conflict of the Second World War. Whilst Fall Blau was Germany's last chance to win the war, Kursk would be the point of no return. There was still more blood to be shed, and it would be another year before the Germans were pushed out of Russian soil.